Your Excellency and distinguished guests. The line was long, and the young farmhand's patience was short. So when he reached a man in uniform sitting behind the desk, he scribbled down his signature and left as quickly as he could. Walking out of the door at a fast pace, the young farmhand barely had time to think about what he had just signed up for. Convinced by a cousin that this would be a good experience for him, Edward Fitzgerald, at only 25 years of age, had just signed up to serve on the front line in World War I. Edward is my great-great-uncle. The TSS Manganui was only a few years old when Edward hopped abroad. The sun was bright, and Edward was excitedly naive to embark on this new journey. It took 40 days of travelling, 40 days of seasickness, and 40 nights of restlessness before Edward disembarked at Port Suez, an Egyptian port near the Suez Canal. Shortly after being disembarked, Edward had his first war experiences. Brave, brutal, and bloody are just 3 words you could use to describe Edward's first encounter with World War I. Day in, day out, Edward fought. Early starts, little food, the continuous loss of friends, fighting unknown enemies, and nightmares that turned into living daymares. The blood, the pain, the unceasing and relentless noise of gunshots and screams, these things all just became a part of the routine for Edward. Men killing men, day in, day out. In 1917, Edward ended up fighting in the Battle of Passchendaele, the third and last battle fought in this area of Belgium. Passchendaele has been described by some as a living nightmare, and the descriptions of water-filled mud craters and barbed wire justify that term. The conditions the men suffered were some of the worst of the war, and those who were eventually to return home to New Zealand did so as completely broken men. The Battle of Passchendaele lasted for 101 days and had over 217,000 casualties. To put that into perspective, that is the whole of Wellington City and more. Edward soon realised that this adventure his cousin had once described to him was not what it was made out to be. Edward was a farmer back home, and so was not forced into the army, but instead chose to join. After serving some time overseas, Edward was ready to return home again, but unfortunately, he didn't get that option. The 18th of October 1917, a light frost covered the ground, typical of a spring morning in Tuatapere, Southland, the day Edward's family received the news they hoped would never come. Filled with both disbelief and sadness, Edward's family read and reread every word over and over in hope that they'd find a mistake somewhere in the telegram. They never did. Edward had died 6 days earlier. The day Edward died in the Battle of Passchendaele was on the 12th of October, 1917. This day is described as New Zealand's blackest day. On that date, over 2,700 New Zealand men died beside him. The horrors of war cannot be underestimated. Many men were left with not only physical scarring, but emotional and psychological scarring that became just as permanent as the physical loss of limbs. Perhaps, after all, Edward was one of the lucky ones. 65 million men from over 30 countries were actively involved in World War I. 65 million men leaving their homes to protect their country. 65 million men leaving loved ones and families behind. Nearly 10 million of which never returned home again. Edward was not the only relative of mine to fight. He, together with both of my grandfathers, fought in wars as part of the New Zealand Armed Forces. Different wars, different countries, different time periods. What they all had in common, though, was they fought for us and our unknown futures. Lest we forget, a phrase synonymous with remembrance. But what does it actually mean? In war terms, it refers to not forgetting those affected or involved in war. But how do we keep memories alive when we live in such different times? In 1914, when World War I began, technology was at its infancy. Who would have thought that only 100 years later, technology would have developed from telegrams to touchscreens? And now, our infantrymen are fighting wars with the latest technology at their disposal and can be in contact with colleagues using computer-aided missiles so accurate that, unlike in the World Wars, you don't even have to be in the same country as your enemy, let alone look them in the eye. And as far as Edward is concerned, what is ironic about this development in technology is that it's the very thing that connects us to the past. Even in researching my family history and being able to recount Edward's story, technology was a vital source of information. I am so grateful to Uncle Eddie and all the other men who fought for our freedom. May technology, gratitude, and pride ensure that none of us ever forget. Thank you.